Worse than students. Thank you. It's easier to get a class of engineers quiet than this lot. Maybe that's a good sign for the discussion part of the morning later on. Good morning, friends, colleagues, visitors. I'm Professor Shane Allwright, Registrar of Trinity College Dublin, and I'm here in my capacity as College Officer with responsibility for civic engagement. And in that capacity, I'm very pleased to welcome you to Trinity College in general and to our Science Gallery in particular. The Science Gallery is celebrating its 5th anniversary this year, and in that short time span has become quite a flagship for the college. Indeed, we now have a franchise in London, and with the help of Google, we hope to set up 8 other franchises as far apart as from New York, Bangalore, Singapore, and Melbourne, and 4 or 3 other cities. Last year, the gallery welcomed its 1 millionth visitor, a fantastic achievement in just 5 short years. We do hope you'll be able to stay on to visit the gallery after lunch. Before we start, please take note of the emergency exits. There, there, and there. And I presume there as well. And I would ask you all kindly to turn off your mobile phones. I understand that we have representatives from U3A groups from, is that the next slide? No. From Ballymun, Tala, Lucan, Dublin City, Blessington, Maynooth, Sutton and Baldoyle, Blackrock and Waterford, and perhaps others, and please forgive me if I've left anybody out. You are all most welcome. And I'd like to extend a special welcome to Stuart Pollard, Regional Trustee for Northern Ireland, the Third Age Trust. As a university, Trinity is committed to both lifelong learning from cradle to grave, and to community engagement. And this U3A Open Forum, in association with Age Action, is an opportunity for the college to interact with the wider community in the context of self-directed learning. Trinity has a vibrant research programme into age-related research in all its aspects. It's one of Trinity's main flagship research themes. And through Trinity EngAGE, the Centre for Research in Ageing, which has upwards of 120 researchers, Trinity has embarked on a programme of multidisciplinary research encompassing the mind, body, social environment, and built environment. And we think this will be of interest and certainly relevance to members of U3A and similar organisations in Ireland. The programme for today is, firstly, that we're going to hear a lecture called on the topic of engaging, not aging, from Professor Roseanne Kenny, the Director of Trinity EngAGE, and Professor Ian Robertson. We will then hear some information about U3A UK, and then some information about U3A in Ireland, which Mr. Robin Webster, CEO of Age Action, is very kindly going to talk to us about. And this should feed nicely into a discussion of how the U3A concept can be further developed in Ireland. But before we proceed, I'd like to thank Professor James Lunny and his wife, Dr. Linda Lunny, who took the initiative of talking to our Provost, Professor Patrick Prendergast, about the possibility of engaging with U3A and possibly setting up a Trinity U3A. The Provost is indeed very supportive of this concept. The idea of this U3A Open Forum came about as part of their efforts to encourage Trinity to get involved in the U3A movement in a wider sense. So thank you very much both to James and to Linda. Thanks also to Professor Roseanne Kenny for providing Trinity EngAGE as a platform for this project. And thanks and particularly to other members of the steering group, including the chair, Professor Joe Harbison. And finally, thanks to Trinity Foundation and particularly to Jana O'Cleary, whose energy and hard work has brought this all together. Unfortunately, due to a family bereavement, she's unable to be with us today. We're now going to hear from a lecture from Professor Roseanne and Professor Ian Robertson. And I believe they're going to tell us why it's important to stay engaged and active as we get older. Professor Kenny leads the ageing research theme in Trinity. She's director, as I've already said, of the Trinity EngAGE Centre for Research in Ageing. She's principal investigator of TILDA, the Irish longitudinal study on ageing. Some of you may have been enrolled in this study. She's head of the Department of Medical Gerontology at St. James's Hospital, director of the Mercer's Institute for Successful Ageing at St. James's, and her research expertise is in cardiovascular and mobility disorders of ageing. Ian Robertson is Professor of Psychology at Trinity and was the founding director of Trinity College Institute of Neuroscience. He was the first psychologist to be elected a member of the Royal Irish Academy. He's a visiting professor at University College London and a visiting scientist at the Rutman Research Institute, Toronto. He has a wealth of scientific publications, but also a number of popular science books. His latest of these, The Winner Effect: How Power Affects Your Brain, was published last year. His current research interests are in developing new methods for measuring and altering brain function and the application of these methods to a range of clinical and social problems. Ian is director of the Neuroenhancement for Independent Lives program. So without further ado, I will ask Roseanne and Ian to step forward and take the podium.
You're all very welcome. And Ian and I are going to do a double act. I'm going to do the first half of the talk, and then Ian is the second Ronnie. I don't know, I'm the short one. So I'm going to set the scene for aging demographics, how it's changing, how our society is changing very rapidly in Ireland and beyond. And then Ian is going to come in with the second punch on the brain and aging and contextualize it in the context of the U3A, why everybody's here today. So people are living longer. It's absolutely true that for most of humanity, only 3 to 4%, and this is a very consistent number, lived to 65 and beyond. Even in ancient Greek times, there were, as far as we can ascertain, men who lived, particularly men, into their 70s and 80s, because they were the writers of the time, but it was about that proportion of the population. So up until very recently, that was the norm. And then a remarkable thing started to happen about 100 years ago. People started to live longer, more people started to live longer. And these are the countries that we have really good records of life and death from. And do I have a pointer? I can't point down here. Okay. So, and from 1840 onwards, you can see there's almost a linear increase in life expectancy in these countries, Norway, New Zealand, Iceland, etc. That is actually equivalent to an increase of 3 months per year, every year, year on year since then, or 5 hours per day. It's hard to get your head around that, but what it means is a baby girl born today will live on average 3 months longer than a baby girl born this time last year in Ireland. That's what it means. And this line continues to increase in this linear fashion. It doesn't seem to be tailing off. The projections are that about half of baby girls born today in Western culture will live to 100 or beyond. So this is a fantastic achievement. But it's been unprecedented in our history. It's equated to global warming in its enormity. So it's difficult for me not to be able to point this out here, but this is on this side, you'll see what the demographic, that means the number of people in each different population. Thank you so much, well done. the number of people in each different age category, the proportions of men and women and men in each age category looks like now-ish. So there's your 90 plus, 85 plus, etc. And this is what's projected to happen in the next 20 years. In Ireland, this applies also. There'll be that much of an increase in women and men in the 75 age bracket, for example. The 80 to 85, 85 to 90 bracket will increase by 68% in Ireland over the next 20 years. So huge changes in our demographic. It's not just Ireland, of course. This is a global phenomenon. And the biggest increase, because the baby boomers are the ones who are driving this and who are living longer into these different trajectories with time, the biggest increase proportionately is going to be in the over 85s and over 100s. In fact, by 2030 in Japan, 1 in 4 people will be over the age of 85. Why? Well, we're living longer. And I'll come on to the reasons for that in a moment. But also fertility rates have dropped dramatically, globally, both in developed and developing cultures. And they're continuing to drop. So that for the first time in many countries, there are more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 5. And this is so very shortly in Ireland. Now, this has never happened before in the history of the human race. This is new to us. Some cultures are experiencing this earlier than we and others will, particularly developed countries. But look at the proportion of people over the age of 65 in Japan by 2030, nearly half of the population. Germany, etc. But as you can see from this, that it's not just selected cultures. The same trend is taking place in India, in China, and they have a big problem because of the one-child rule that was introduced some time ago. And you can see that the least developed countries, even there are major changes occurring. So this is a huge phenomenon. Why are we living longer? Better health care, certainly. Better awareness of what causes ill health, because that's what causes death ultimately. Less stressful lives, believe it or not. Better environments. They're the things which we know have influenced the longevity of the baby boomers. Now, actually, what determines longevity in people over the age of 80, because there are 80-year-old survivors, is probably a bit different or additive to these 4 components. And that's something that's of great interest to the research community at the moment. What are we going to die from? Well, these are the common causes of death. As you'd expect, diseases of the circulatory system, that's stroke, that's heart disease. Neoplasms, that's cancers. Diseases of the respiratory system, asthma, chronic bronchitis, chest infections, diseases of the digestive system, that's the gut, diseases of the nervous system and sensory organs. They're the top causes of death. And they've remained pretty static, actually, in terms of attributable causes in developed countries. But there's a huge difference, even in Europe, in life expectancy. Top of the graph here is Iceland, where men can expect to live to 82, compared to the Russian Federation, where the average life expectancy is 62, a 20-year gap. 20-year difference. That's, of course, enormous. But from a university's perspective, from our research perspective, why is this the case? How many of these factors which are influencing this big difference in life expectancy can be modified, can be changed? We know that your social economic status influences your life expectancy. The professional classes live longer than manual workers, for example. And there are a number of factors which we know influence this, like diet, like genetics, like environment, like stress, all of the things which contribute to longer lifespan. But there are also other influences that we're not aware of. And again, they're a very important research focus. The implications for me and for you at a personal level of this demographic change is a very big change in our society, as I've said, but also a huge change in human resource available, for example, should we become ill. And the tax revenue available to support our retirements. In the 1900s, there were 22 working people for every retired person. By 2024, there'll be about 2 working people for every retired person in Ireland and in England. These are pretty stark figures. This means for us at an individual level that we have to think outside the box in terms of our longevity and be much more responsible ourselves for securing healthy lifespan. Because longer lifespan is one thing, but unless it's healthy, unless we can be independent and enjoy that period of time, it changes the picture completely if we become disabled or infirm. And there's a huge difference in healthy lifespan, just as there is in life expectancy in Europe. These are European figures. So you can take it here in Ireland, which is IE here, about half of the years we are projected to live after the age of 65 will be healthy life years. Half won't. Half of those additional years, we will experience some illness, chronic disability. Now, can that be helped? Well, yes, because in Sweden, it's 70% or more of those extended life years are healthy life years. And in other cultures, it's 24% are healthy. The rest are unhealthy. So again, as with life expectancy, there's a huge difference in healthy life expectancy. And that's something we're working really hard to identify early biomarkers, early changes that indicate that something might go wrong down the track, that we can modify, we can change early so that that doesn't happen. And that's part of what our research in Trinity, including the longitudinal study of aging, is about. What can we do? Well, just a few tasters, because Ian is going to come into this in much more detail in a pragmatic way. Many animal species live for a very long time, and there's a lot of active research in this area. The red urchin for 200 years, the Antarctic sponge for 1,550 years, the saltwater clam for 160 years, etc. And we think that this particular jellyfish has an eternal lifespan. So as you can imagine, there are researchers and industry very interested in the factors which are influencing longevity in animal species. And that's just one area of research interest. And there's more and more, and you'll have read this recently in the media because it's hit it, there's more and more interest in genetic modifiers, or how we can, with our behavior, modify some of our genetic behavior. And diet and the insulin IGF-1 receptor are areas of very active research and recently have been shown to influence longevity. And these are cultures in which experience a higher prevalence of longer life than others. The Ashkenazi Jews, Hawaiian Japanese, Italians, Californians, New Englanders, some Germans, and some Chinese. And what's really interesting is that people in Germany who live to 100 and beyond have different variants of this particular gene, the insulin gene, which is modified by diet, dietary control, than Germans who live to 90 to 95. So that's why I said earlier on that there's a growing interest in what determines longevity in those who achieve 80 and grow and longevity beyond 80. There may be different factors. Finally, good old Woody Allen. We know that diet and dietary restriction, exercise and stress and social networks are important in making our extended life better in terms of quality of life, but also health, and also increasing lifespan. But, you know, the message needs to get out there. You can live to be 100 if you give up all the things that make you want to live to be 100. And I'm going to end on a social engagement note that I think is very pertinent to the UE3. And it's a lovely story about Rosetta that many of you may be familiar with. So Rosetta was a little village outside Rome in the 1800s, the late 1890s and early 1900s. Many people had to emigrate from Rosetta to the USA. And they all emigrated to this one place in Pennsylvania. And it hit our radar because a physician who was former professor of medicine in Oklahoma University, Stuart Wolf, was giving a lecture to local general practitioners in the Oklahoma area because he had a holiday residence nearby, and he was kind of doing this in his spare time. And after the lecture, a local GP asked him if he would join him for a drink, and he did. And he said, "You were talking about heart disease being the biggest killer of men in their 50s in America today. 40s and 50s, as it was in the 1940s and 1950s. And Stuart Wolf said yes, but he said, actually, I don't see any deaths from heart disease in one of the towns that I am now responsible for, which was Rosetta, Oklahoma, where most of those who had emigrated from Rosetta in Italy were now living. And Stuart Wolf got interested in this. He kind of didn't believe it initially, but for the next summer, he brought his students. They went through the records. They were allowed by the town mayor to set up a whole laboratory in the town hall. They went through the death certs and found, yes, that mortality did seem to be very low, if non-existent, in people under 65. There didn't appear to be any suicides. Then they looked at diet. It must be diet. They have a different diet here, and they found, in fact, that the dough of their pizzas was much higher in fat, 42%, than dough in pizzas elsewhere in the USA. It didn't seem to be the diet. They looked at the environment. There must be something in the environment, but no, it didn't seem to be the case because there was no difference in any of the environmental toxins that they measured in Rosetta compared to nearby villages, which did have high heart rate and other causes of death in young men. They looked at exercise, and in fact, it was quite the opposite. Exercise didn't seem to be any more prevalent in Rosettans. And then they looked at genetics by looking at Rosettans who had emigrated from Italy to elsewhere in the USA versus in Rosetta, Oklahoma. Didn't find any difference in genetics. And then it dawned on him what the difference was. A young priest had come in the early 1900s with some of the emigrants, and he had set up a church in the center of this USA, Rosetta. And the houses that evolved were built in the same kind of structure, same social environment, physical environment structure as they had been in Rosetta, built around the church and a town and a square. He noticed that Rosettans visited each other frequently, stopping to chat to each other. They cooked for each other. He learned that the extended family clans all lived in one house, 3 generations sometimes living in one roof. There was great respect for older people, aging, grandparents in that society. At Mass, he saw a unifying and calming effect of the church. There were 22 separate civic organizations in a town of 2,000 people. They all spoke their own local language. There was a particularly egalitarian ethos. So if someone did make a little bit more money than somebody else, it was never flaunted. And he realized that the secret of Rosetta was Rosetta itself. And this is the first time that social engagement and our interaction with other people, which has always been considered a soft science, and remember, this is at the time when genetics and all of that sort of exciting stuff was happening. This is the first time that sociology was found to be important in impacting on health. And we know from, this is just one example of 148 studies that have looked at this, that the quality of your social relationships is a stronger risk factor, for example, for heart disease or stroke disease, as smoking, as alcohol excess, as low physical activity, and high cholesterol, those well-known cardiovascular risk factors. So that's some of the stuff we're looking at in the Irish Longitudinal Study of Aging. And I'm going to leave you with the thought, and Ian will take the floor, that an Ireland that is good to grow old in is an Ireland that would be better for everybody. And I hope that today's initial step towards Youth 3A will contribute greatly towards our mission in making Ireland a good place in which to grow old. Ian.
Roseanne always makes me feel great about being 61, 62 in 2 weeks. So I'm going to present a mystery to you. Here we have the awful spectre of Alzheimer's disease, healthy brain on the left and the Alzheimer's brain on the right. But here we have a mystery. University of the Third Age, you're all involved in. People with less than 8 years of education have 2.5 times the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease than people with more than 8 years of education. I'm going to try and solve that mystery for you today, but I want you to hold that in your mind. So the first obvious solution that's been given to that connection is that it's a spurious correlation, that some third factor, for instance, our family inheritance, our genetics, leads to both the higher education, via intelligence, for instance, and separately leads to a more disease-resistant brain. So basically, it's a question of biological fitness. So the conclusion there is there's no actual causal link, and it's not causal. However, Sweden is a remarkable place, and in Sweden they managed to get a group of twins, identical twins, who were demented and who had non-demented siblings. Here we have the number of these twins who left school at the minimum legal age for their cohort, which, depending on when they were born, could be 14, 15, 16, 17. So you'll see that 25 of this group of twins left school at the legal minimum age of the ones who were demented. Only 11 of the non-demented identical twins left school at the legal minimum age. Of terms of those who stayed on in school, 8 of the demented identical twins had, whereas 21 of the non-demented identical twins had stayed on in school. This shows that the genetic explanation cannot be on its own completely right. I'm not saying there's no genetics involved in Alzheimer's disease. Of course there is. All I'm saying is the connection between education and protection against dementia cannot be eliminated by explaining it by genetic causes, because these were identical twins. So here's a second solution to the mystery. Education just creates noise in the data, and when we get a good medical test of Alzheimer's disease, that will cut through all this kind of noise that education creates. And education essentially is affecting maybe the tests we use to diagnose Alzheimer's disease, like memory tests, etc. So, well, we do have excitingly, we do have a kind of test for Alzheimer's disease. It's using a technique called PET, positron emission tomography, PET imaging. And what it does is it visualizes these clumps of amyloid protein in the brain, which is very toxic to brain cells and kills off the brain cells. And this is the main candidate kind of mechanism for Alzheimer's disease. And In America now, just in the last year, they have, you can now go to your doctor and they will send you for a PET scan, and you make them, and they will say whether you have this substance, these plaques in your brain or not. And this is done in private medicine there, and I saw an article in the New York Times last autumn by someone who had gone for this test and was very depressed because the doctor had said they had Alzheimer's disease based on the presence of this amyloid plaques in the brain. So you would expect for a test like that, wouldn't you, that people who had this positive result in this test should have more dementia than people who did not, and indeed that happens for people with a high school education or less. The blue there, this is a dementia rating scale. The blue is people who have the amyloid in their brain according to this test, and the red is people who don't. And you'll see that, this test is working. Wonderful. We now finally have a medical test for Alzheimer's disease. People who did at least some college education, it worked, but not so well. Not quite so well. But when you got to people who had education that was college, and remember, college education in America is probably at a lower level on average than university education here. So if people who had college education or more, for instance, teachers, the test no longer worked. And so if you were if you're a teacher or someone who's higher education, who's more likely to be going to private medicine in the States, you could be sent off to and come back with the dreadful news that you have Alzheimer's disease based on a test that actually doesn't discriminate for people of a high level of education. So that's very good news for all of you here, all of us who are involved in education. So how do we explain this mysterious connection? Well, here's one of my favorite Naples street scenes, multi-level. And if you think about human behavior, the kind of behavior that Roseanne was so beautifully explaining there in terms of the interaction between, for instance, social interaction and the biology of the body, you can analyze all of us here at a number of different levels. James Watson, the co-discoverer of DNA, famously said, "Everything is physics." James will be glad to hear that. All the rest is social work. And I like to say to my molecular biology colleagues, you realize you're social workers. Because, of course, that's the next level up, molecular biology. Then we have the cellular level, looking at the cells in the brain and the body. And then we have the systems, looking at the interaction of great parts of the brain, we can study using various types of brain imaging. And then we have the psychological and the behavioral. And then we have the social. And if we are studying human beings, we can choose to analyze at these various different levels. Now, the reductionism is the current prevailing dogma in medicine and in a lot of social thinking as well, with the assumption being that science, that all the psychological and social and things are all basically soft science, and the real job is to bore down to the molecular level, and we will eventually get down to even the quantum level, and be able to explain all these higher level fuzzy things like social and psychological by these lower level basic processes. And that's reductionism. But here I've shown you that a social artifact, a social phenomenon, which is education, seems to be having the opposite effect. It seems to be shaping, going the other way, that something we contrive, and we saw that in the Rosetto example as well, something we contrive socially seems to be having downstream effects. So are we then anti-reductionists? Are we saying somehow that these lower level systems are being influenced by these higher level ones? Well, this study of German medical students imaged the structure, the size of their brains You sometimes see these brain imaging studies, and it's about the activity, the blood oxygenation. This is actually size, the grey matter of the brain. And they measured the grey matter of the brain before they started studying for their finals, 3 months after they'd finished, when they were sitting their finals, and then 3 months later. What they found was these students expanded their brains. They expanded the parietal cortex at the back of their brain, but even more intriguingly, they expanded the memory centers, the back of the hippocampus, the memory storage center. And you see from this bottom graph here that that expansion continued even after they stopped studying for their finals. So yes, education builds bigger, better brains. So that's our first solution to the mystery, the mysterious connection. A better connected brain is therefore more able to cope with the disease, for instance, these horrible amyloid plaques, and that hypothesis is supported. But it's not the complete answer, because other things are important. For instance, current activity. It's not all about the education you had, it's about what you're doing with your brain now. Including, and we've heard about this, our social engagement with other people. So this is a lovely paper from a Chicago group, Bennett. And what they looked at here, they took a group of people, like us in this room, and they gave us tests of our cognitive function now, memory, etc. And then they waited until we died, and they were all older than most of the people in this room, and then they did post-mortems in their brain. And along the bottom here, you have how much pathology there was in the brain, how much of this Alzheimer's, they were actually neurofibrillary tangles, and how much damage there was to the brain. And so here we have the blue are people who had relatively sparse social networks, who weren't well connected in the way they were in Rosetto, compared to those with relatively dense, good quality social networks. That's the red. And where there was no pathology, there was not much of a difference. Where there was a little bit of pathology, you started to see that those with a sparse social network had more pathology than those with dense. When you had a higher level yet of a pathology level of 1, the difference even expanded. When it got to 1.5, it became enormous. And then finally, at the maximum level of pathology, those with dense social networks showed their cognitive function was not linked to the pathology in their brain. In other words, just to summarize this, here you have a putative disease, causative disease agent, which you can measure from the post-mortem pathology, the actual structure of the brain, the damage to the brain, these neurofibrillary tangles in the brain. Okay, here's the disease. Then you have a symptom of the disease, which is the measured memory and cognitive function, which had been measured earlier. You would hope, wouldn't you, there would be some relationship between these two if you have the right disease marker. And indeed, there is a relationship. The blue lines there show you a very beautiful relationship that makes you confident that you have a good disease marker. However, that link is broken in people with dense social networks. You cease to have a relationship between the disease process in the brain and the symptoms, the cognitive functions. And that is an extraordinary finding, very completely along the lines of what Roseanne was saying about the Rosetto. Now, Carol Brain and her colleagues, Valenzuela and Cambridge in Australia, have contrived a composite score of people's cognitive lifestyle and divided them into high and low cognitive lifestyles. High cognitive lifestyle is where you've had a relatively high level of education, where you have high levels of current mental activity, and where you have high social engagement. And what they found was, post-mortem, the people with a high cognitive lifestyle have thicker brains. This is the actual thickness of the cortical surface compared to those with a low cognitive lifestyle. So we've solved the mysterious connection, have we? Yes, we have. We could build bigger brains, better connected, therefore better able to resist the disease. There's a little but here, which is only very strongly supported in the animal literature, but not in the, yet very much in the human literature. So it may be wrong, but it's intriguing. If you do a similar thing to dogs, like we did to the humans, of following them up until they die and then doing post-mortem in the brain, but these dogs have been kept either in standard cages or in fun cages with enriched cages with different materials and things to play with, you find that the dogs in the enriched environment don't even have these amyloid plaques in their brain. So the intriguing possibility is that these enriched lifestyle factors not only help the brain cope with disease, but the intriguing possibility, and it's only a possibility, is that they may actually affect the disease process itself. This is the only study in humans I know of showing that cognitive activity affects the actual presence of the amyloid plaques in the brain. Now, let's go back to my Neapolitan multi-level street scene. My view of this whole area is that multi-story problems need multi-story solutions, and it's not either reductionism or top-downism, but we have to analyze the whole complex beauty of human society at multiple different levels simultaneously if we're going to solve these problems. And of course, our overwhelming aim here, because cognitive function is the major impediment to quality of life in older people, our aim is to break the awful link between age and cognitive function. And that the U3A is essentially, I believe, doing neurosurgery in effecting that. So, what is this mysterious connection? Can we bore down a little bit and try and understand the mechanisms? Why is it, okay, we're getting better connected brains, maybe we're affecting the disease process, but why? Let's get a bit reductionist about this. What's the answer? Novelty. Novelty seems to be a critical mediating factor here. We know that, and I'm having to summarize a whole lot of research. I'm not going to spell out the means by which I've come to these conclusions, but the reason it's published reasonably well established. Enriched environments, and this is taken a lot from the animal literature where you give complex, interesting environments to animals. I think in human beings the best example of that is social environments. Enriched environments enhance memory. It seems to do so, and a number of studies are now showing that there's a chemical messenger in the brain called noradrenaline, which if I suddenly clap my hands, I've just altered the noradrenaline levels in all of your brains. And if it gets too high, it's to do with stress and can interfere, but there's an optimal level of alertness that we can have, which is mediated by noradrenaline. And enrichments, the effects of the complex environments and possibly the social environments on our beneficial effects on our cognitive functions seem to be mediated by noradrenaline. And the biggest trigger of noradrenaline is novelty, new things, curiosity, mental challenge as well. And noradrenaline has remarkable properties. It can stop these horrible amyloid or reduce the toxicity of these horrible amyloid cells. It can neutralize them to some extent. So, and also it acts like a fertilizer in the brain. It makes learning embed itself in the brain better and helps build brain connections, like kind of brain oil. And just briefly, just in the next building here, we have recently shown you can, for the first time in the world, we have shown that this little tiny locus ceruleus in the brainstem, the only source of noradrenaline in the brain, we've shown that you can, the pupil dilation in response to interesting or novel or challenging tasks, the pupil dilation, your pupil dilating precisely goes in tandem with that locus ceruleus. So we now have, using simple pupil dilation measures, we can now measure the activity of this remarkable chemical in the brain. And this is important because promote cognitive reserve, and cognitive reserve is education, social engagement, and mental stimulation. The same things which promote this also increase noradrenaline. So for instance, people with a higher level of education, higher levels of IQ, show bigger pupil dilations to hard problems. Their brain rises to the challenge by secreting this chemical. Difficult tasks, if I gave you all mental arithmetic just now, all of your pupils would dilate with the effort of doing them. Other people dilate our pupils, whether through attraction or hate. Actively remembering things dilates our pupils. This is all based on sound evidence. And novelty dilates our pupils, new things. So have we solved the mystery? Possibly. Because education, throughout a lifetime, triggers millions of mini doses of this magic chemical noradrenaline, helping build a better connected and bigger, literally, brain. Mentally challenging activities and mentally challenging jobs do the same. Doesn't have to be jobs, can be voluntary activity, etc. The joys and challenges of engaging with other people also secrete this chemical. So this lifetime of boosted noradrenaline activity may affect the disease process itself. And that's an intriguing hypothesis. I can't stand over it yet because there's not been enough human research. And we can now measure these effects. So maybe I have at least partly solved the mystery. Through education, enrichment, and engagement, we may be able to make old age a much more cognitively and hence emotionally fruitful place. And I'm going to finish with my hero, the man who has made being old sexy. I've seen him 4 times now, Leonard Cohen. I loved him when he was 21, and I love him when he's 78. And this is the quote we should all go away with. It's the line from one of his songs. It's the cracks that let the light come in. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're all sitting here with pupils dilated like mad, with our noradrenaline surging around our bodies and our brain cells expanding as we sit here. We have just a couple of minutes for questions for either Roseanne or for Ian. Both talks were, I thought, were absolutely wonderful in their both breadth and depth. If anyone has questions for our 2 speakers, I'd be very happy to take them. Please.
Professor Kenny, you said that one of the biggest problems of disease is the circulatory diseases. Now, I remember reading somewhere some time ago that when during the Vietnam War, I think it was the United States used conscription, they found that very many of the youngsters they were around 19, 20-year-olds, had circulatory problems at that age. So is the foundations for old health and old age set in youth?
Yeah. Actually, there's a Barker hypothesis that it starts in utero, in the fetus, and that the mother's nutritional intake actually influences some of our genetic activity, so that, and one of them is activity around atherosclerosis, which is what you're talking about, stiffness of vessels, and in that, indeed, that her in utero activity was influenced by her own mother. So it may be your grandmother that influences what happens to one in utero. So yes, our childhood does set the seed for physical and mental health in adulthood. And even our own research in Trinity is showing that childhood events can have an impact longer term on older age health, both cardiovascular, circulatory, but also mental and cognitive health.
So we should be concentrating on young people then?
Absolutely. It's a life course approach. Well, not rather than, because there are modifiable things at all ages, but it is a life course approach. It is important that we get, and that actually reflects very much with what Ian was speaking of in terms of education, novelty, etc. But yes, it's a life course approach. Childhood matters when it comes to getting it right for our older age.
Do you think that...
Sorry, maybe there are other questions. I don't want to maybe we can come back
I
to
can
you.
see you at the lunch. Is that all right? Yeah, we can talk, yeah.
Have we any other questions? There's a gentleman at the back. We do have a roving mic. I think you have it, do you?
Yeah, while I was listening very carefully to those wonderful talks and taking a few notes, I was just wondering, will they be available at any stage online or in print?
We're garbed like this because we're being podcast, apparently. So it'll be on the Trinity website as a podcast.
Thank you. Any other questions? Slightly blinded. Okay, microphone over here. Thanks, Jacinta.
I just want to ask, thank you. Is living alone when you're old less healthy than living in a pair or with children? I know you can have too many in a house, but
the answer is not necessarily. Some people, it suits some people to live on their own or to have relatively sparse social contact. We're talking here about averages. People can have a very rich internal life on their own, and they can have novelty and change without ever interacting very much with other people. And so it's not, I suspect it's the novelty and the demands on your brain rather than people per se. And so the answer is not necessarily at all, depending on the individual.
Two final questions here and here. Is there somebody back there? Oh, all right, okay. We'll take you next then. This gentleman here, and then this lady at the back.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Just for a further elaboration on what you've just responded to from the previous question. You're talking about the noradrenaline being stimulated. If people with the internet, they sometimes feel as if they're in a virtual social reality. Has there been, they may not be physically seeing some people, but how have you differentiated between the social interaction, which is either physical people or virtual?
It's a very good question. The only research I know of this is when they've got older people to surf the internet and they've done brain imaging while they're doing it, they've found this significantly increased blood flow in the front parts of the brain, the frontal lobes, which is associated with active mental activity. So my guess is that probably that could be a very good source of stimulation.
And I don't think there's an awful lot on this, except that it makes a difference. But we do know that there's something about human contact which probably has an added effect.
Just literally two more questions. This gentleman here and the gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. I'm more or less on the same general point. The first question was referring to the foundation when people are young and the start they get in life and etc. But I'm just wondering, as we get older and say I'm late 60s now, can I correct any deficiencies that there have been in these areas that Ian Robertson outlined in terms of education, social interaction, novelty, stimulation, etc.? Or is it just too late at this stage?
The brain is plastic until death. So in other words, it's constantly being reshaped and remolded by experience. You can learn the piano when you're 80, but this learning will be slower and more difficult than when you're 8. But there's absolutely no reason why you cannot adjust, maybe not completely undo, certainly not undo all these things, but yes, the answer is yes.
And from the dietary perspective, there aren't that many elaborate human experiments, but certainly in animals, we know that middle-aged and later-aged mice who are subjected to a restricted dietary intake, that their aging process is slowed down, not as much as if that occurs in childhood equivalent mice, but certainly the aging process is slowed down. So you can modify factors in aging.
There goes your lunch. Okay, one last question. Very, very briefly.
This is not a question, it's an observation. it would seem what we older people get from this is that you must keep active. I suspect we should all be working till 70 or 75 or 80, whatever it is. But the basic concept is keep very active. I happen to be 88 years of age, and it's interesting that many of the things that you have spoken about, our group keeps very active, and as I said, it's an observation rather than anything else.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to have to close that discussion now. Roseanne and Ian, I hope we'll be there at lunchtime. So you might be able to nab them at lunchtime. I'd like now to move towards the U3A situation, as it were. And to initiate the topic, we're really delighted to have our guest from Northern Ireland, Stuart Pollard, Regional Trustee for Northern Ireland Third Age Trust. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you. Anyone who stops learning is old, whether it's 80 or 20. Anyone who keeps learning is young. The greatest thing in life is to keep your mind young. I wrote that down last night without knowing what I was going to hear this morning. You may or may not agree with many things that Henry Ford said and did, but he certainly got that one right. So I'm going to talk about the U3A in the UK, and it's been very successful, and I want to talk about the reasons why it has grown so big in the UK. So most of what I will talk about will be around the work that the Third Age Trust does. But I've also been asked to say a couple of things about the international U3A, so I've included some of that. I have to confess I don't actually know very much about that, so I had to do the good U3A thing and go off and find out about it. And lastly, I'll finish with just a very brief look at what's going on in Northern Ireland. The photograph on this first slide is actually the cover of a little book that the Third Age Trust produced to publicise the U3A to non-members. And it shows what's probably one of the most popular activities, a walking group. And I've always felt it's a bit paradoxical that a learning organisation, why is the most popular group walking? Well, I think after what we've been hearing today, we don't have to justify that anymore. What's important for a U3A is it does what the members want. And some will want academic study, that's where it started. Some want the social engagement, and some want the healthy part that comes from physical exercise. And U3A activities are all related to those things. What happens in individual U3As, what the members do, is the important thing. And you all know what you're doing within your own U3A, but maybe you're less aware of the sort of background as to how the movement has developed. And the first point I want to make is that, in fact, there are two different models of U3A. You may be aware that it started in France, and I'm afraid French is not one of the classes I go to, so I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce it. But it was started by Professor Pierre Vella, note that name, it will come back later, in Toulouse. And it was in response to a government decree. The French government in early 1970s decreed by law that the universities must do more to engage older people for adult learning. I think possibly they were a little bit jealous of what Harold Wilson's government was doing with the Open University and wanted to do something similar. But anyhow, Professor Vella put this idea out in the university, and in France they're called UTA. The important thing there is that the UTA was linked closely to the university, which actually guided it, so it was a true academic thing. Peter Laslett was a Cambridge academic. He looked in the early 80s at bringing U3A to Britain, and he set up a conference to look at that. And he, along with his fellow founders, Eric Midwinter and Michael Young, went for a completely different idea. They felt it was much more important to make it available to everybody, and that people should, rather than being taught, that they should learn from each other. So it becomes a university in the sense that it's people learning, coming together to learn, not necessarily in a lecturing type environment. Peter Laslett and Michael Young, alas, are no longer with us, but Eric Midwinter is very much alive and well, and I had the great privilege of meeting him on Tuesday when he gave the first Founders Lecture, the first one ever that we've done in the U3A. There was about 500 people in London on Tuesday, and this man in his 80s enthralled people for an hour. So I think it's a tremendous privilege to have met him, and I can see how he sparked the U3A off and how it got growing. In the international sense, the idea from Toulouse began to spread very rapidly within France and then to other countries and then right around the world. And I heard on Tuesday somebody from the International University he gave me a number which I just found very hard to comprehend. He said that in China there are now 85,000 U3As. Not 85,000 U3A members, 85,000 U3As. Or groups that maybe not call themselves U3A but are essentially doing the same thing. There is an international association called IUTA, which was founded in 1980. And interesting, the current president of that is Professor Francois Bellard. And yes, he is indeed the son of the original Pierre Bellard. That is very much engaged in trying to spread the message of U3As around the world. They do education and research projects. They hold conferences in some very nice locations, I have to say. I think I might just join. And another way that, that the U3A message is spreading internationally is through virtual U3As. Australia has been particularly big on that. As you can imagine, in Australia, given the distances involved, it's maybe quite hard to have a local U3A. So they use a U3A online, a virtual university of the third age. Now, turning to the sort of main part of what I want to talk about, the U3A in the UK. The Third Age Trust, of which I am a member, is the national support and advisory body for all the UK U3As. It's both a limited company and a registered charity. It's quite a big organisation. Our budget this year was 1.7 million, so there's quite a responsibility there. The latest number I have are that there are 886 U3As in the UK. Majority of them in England, but right around the whole thing. Individual membership is nearly 300,000. Our national conference last year in September was just after the Olympics, and the outgoing chairman said something that I thought was interesting because the Olympics were still fresh in everybody's mind. He said he'd been watching an event and he looked at this stadium of 80,000 people, and then he realised that the U3A people in the UK wouldn't just fill it, they'd fill it 3.5 times. So U3A has become very big. The important thing I want to mention here is the role of the trust. The U3As are the members of the trust, not the individual members in U3As, but the actual organisation. And the relationship between the trust and the U3As is not one of a head office and branches. The trust is there to serve the U3As and to assist them. It's not there to dictate. And so all U3As are operationally independent. In other words, they can more or less run themselves as they like, provided they meet the sort of aims and principles of the U3A movement. So what is the trust trying to do? It's got 3 main objectives. One is to provide support to existing U3As. Another is to provide the support that will help get new U3As started. And the last is to raise the profile of the movement in general, which in turn will help stimulate. So it's all about stimulating the growth of U3A, making it as available to as wide an audience as possible. I sit on the National Executive Committee. I'm relatively new, I only started in September. And what I think is interesting for me is, why did I volunteer to do that? And when I listened to what the previous speakers were saying, that's why I volunteered for it, for the stimulation, to find, I was interested in the U3A, what it had done within my own group, but I wanted to learn a bit more. So that's exactly the reason. So we, the NEC, are actually their board of directors as well as charity trustees, and we're registered at Company House and all the rest of that good stuff. And it's made up of 16 trustees. The Trust also has some full and part-time employees who deliver the services to the members, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But there's a national office in Bromley, which does the admin type stuff, and there's a resource centre also there, so that people can borrow material, opera DVDs, or material for courses or whatever, at no cost. Just to pay the postage, you can get it in your U3A. We also provide a couple of magazines called Third Age Matters and Sources. There we are in all our wonderful glory. I think actually this, I'm obviously not going to go through the whole lot there, but I think it sort of illustrates just graphically where the bulk of it is very big in England, less so in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, but we are trying hard to catch up. Excuse me. I think possibly that might help. I showed this chart to South Tyrone U3A a couple of weeks ago, and the only comment on it was, how does that poor woman in Scotland cope with it all? Not going to go through this chart in detail, but I just want to sort of illustrate to you how the Third Age Trust does what it does. There are three main committees, and really they are kind of related to the three main objectives. The Standing Committee for Education, which advises the Trust on educational matters. There's a Development Subcommittee, which tries to stimulate the growth of new U3As, and there's a Communications Subcommittee, which tries to improve the communications with our members and with the general public. There are also some smaller groups. So, for example, the Third Age Matters magazine is published 5 times a year and is available to all our members free. Quite an interesting magazine. We also have Sources, which is a more academic magazine that's published about 3 times a year, and each one is devoted to a particular topic. So this particular one from last year, the front cover, some of you may or may not recognise, it's actually the Botanic Gardens in Belfast. And the theme of that one was architecture. So there's a series of articles about of architectural interest. So a study group, every so often, will find that their particular topic gets covered in Sources. I'll pick out one more from this chart, and that's the research and shared learning part. Shared learning projects are quite interesting, I think. SLPs for short. A shared learning project is a joint project where a U3A members within it decide that they want to do some research themselves, but partner with somebody else, usually with an institution like a museum or a university, or it could be with another U3A so that you get some cross-fertilisation, or it could be a combination of both. And we've had some very successful ones in Northern Ireland. I won't read through the list, you can see for yourself, but the topics that come out of that have been, the members themselves really enjoyed doing it, and yet it has also provided some valuable reference material. So this chart sort of summarises the total things that we deliver to the members, the benefits and services. Some of it is administrative, like copyright licenses, music license, insurance, etc. Some of it is to help the learning, like the resource centre, and some of it is just to help keep the members going. So there's a lot of material available there for them. Moving a bit closer to home, there are now 21 U3As in Northern Ireland. Omagh District is the latest. It became affiliated or a member of the Trust on April the 1st. And it's the first one that I was involved in starting from scratch. I think that's one of the benefits of having an organisation like the Third Age Trust in place. There are somewhere to go to start to look for help. We're now just about to start, I can't name the town yet because it's not public knowledge, but we were approached by a council in Northern Ireland who felt that there was a need for a U3A locally, and they wanted to know how to start it. So they were able to just look us up on the web. They sent in a request to the national office, which immediately bounced it back to me. So now we can go and show them how to start a U3A, basically, and I'm looking forward to starting that. So as you can see, U3A has grown remarkably. I think it has grown because of all the good things that the previous speakers talked about. I'm a passionate believer that it is a very good thing. So, any questions? I don't know, is there time for questions, or do you want to do them as part of the panel discussion?
informative and very, very useful presentation there. I think in the panel discussion there'll be lots of questions and lots of ideas for how we might adopt some of that model within Ireland. Small token of our appreciation from the Trinity shop, including a cat that you would go on your walks. I'd now like to ask Robin Webster, the CEO of EngAGE, which, as most of you know, promotes positive ageing and better policies and services for older people in Ireland. And Robin is going to talk to us about U3A in Ireland, and particularly about setting U3A in perhaps a broader context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shane, for the warm welcome to all of us, and your colleagues in Trinity College for this initiative. And there's so many different ways I applaud this initiative. One, as a former teacher in this institution, and which I always thought should be much more community educated minded than it was, and therefore this trend is welcome. But also in order to encourage all of us to develop different forms of learning. Now, I did this because I was going to welcome people, so I'm going to change it as I go along. But I think this is very important as a stepping stone to developing the U3A in the future, bringing us together, establishing much closer links between other educational institutions. And one of the points we've always said in EngAGE was that the U3A is not the only model, it's just one model, and there are all sorts of ways in which we can develop learning and social engagement through statutory and voluntary and all sorts of other organisations. And I won't have time to do this. But this initiative is very timely in the sense that it comes at a time when we're awaiting the first national positive ageing strategy. It has been a bit late in developing, and it is apparently going to be published in the next 2 months. And what is important for all of us is, let's hope that this strategy recognises some of the many points that have been made here today, the vital importance, and I quote from my original notes, continuing learning and community participation. And I hadn't mentioned, hadn't talked to Ian or Roseanne. And that continuing learning and community participation are vital to positive ageing for individuals and our ageing society. And that's critical. Now, the U3A, I think there are a couple of things I think are important in the mass of other means of promoting learning in later life. First of all, U3As as independent self-learning groups have a vital role in demonstrating that older people not only can, but do go on learning, but also that they can manage their own learning. The second point is that U3As, by their very existence, can challenge the widespread ageism that suggests that older people are a burden, are incapable, and show that older people should be part of the solutions to the many social and economic challenges facing Ireland. And EngAGE is an advocacy organisation, so we believe that U3As and older people have an enormous part to play in advocating for a better quality of life for older people, or people of all ages. And the best advice that I've ever heard on how to undermine this ageism is to be interested and interesting. And that applies to individuals and groups, and most of the U3As that I've ever seen, and perhaps Trinity as well. So I'm going to give a potted history of the U3A in Ireland as I've experienced it. The first U3A event was held in October 1983 in Blanchardstown. when the late Tony Downs, who was an innovative and inspiring adult education organiser, invited me on my return home from Scotland to talk about this new U3A movement that started in England. And there was a lot of interest, and nobody had ever heard of it before. But after the talk, 2 women came up to me. They both told me they were both 58. And they thanked me for the encouraging message of the University of the Third Age. The first, because it was the first time that she'd ever been out without her husband. This is 1983, by the way. The second was that she felt stronger to counter the ageist criticism by her daughters of her jogging in the streets with a jogging jacket, with the famous words, "What do you think you're doing at your age, ma'am?" That hasn't gone away yet. You know, ageism is pretty near home sometimes, and I think we need to challenge it wherever we find it. In the following 6 years, ANTHUS, which I was working with, the National Association for Adult Education, tried to raise awareness of learning needs of older people through various conferences, courses, workshops, publications, and a little research, but with limited success. Frankly, particularly for people in the educational business, there was very little recognition that there's any connection between education, learning, and old age. And I'd mark us at 2 out of 10 for changing attitudes. It was very difficult. However, in 1993, Age Action, who had just been established, decided that one of its first priorities should be to promote education. That was to balance, as it were, and even challenge, in quotes, the medical model, which assumes that all older people are either patients or potential patients and nothing else. And we wanted to try and establish a different approach, a broader approach. We set up a broadly representative committee. It was set up and it organised meetings and conferences to raise awareness. But its practical progress was slow and limited. Apart from the endless arguments about the definition of a university and the third age, Stuart is laughing, that went on I remember every meeting, matters arising. What do we mean by university? What do we mean by third age? Endlessly. But also, there were also tensions between informal and formal education providers or supporters, and critically about whether any education activity worthy of the name could possibly be done without a professional educator in charge of it. So fundamental challenges all the time about the basis of the U3A. In 1999, the Department of Education gave a grant to Age Action to promote learning opportunities among older people, with particular regard to promoting the U3A. And we used this to appoint a development officer, a post that has continued to this day in the person of Margaret Fitzpatrick, who has recently been joined by Keelan McCarthy. I'm paid to do this, by the way. Keelan McCarthy, who coordinates our lifelong learning programme with responsibility for intergenerational solidarity and also to adopt the life course approach to all our work. We have continued the painstaking work of helping people to set up their own independent U3As and provide initial support and for the setting up and to provide continuing support, and then encourage U3As to support each other, which they have done through visits and communications and so on. And I was interested in Stuart's comment about China. I went to an international conference on the U3A in Canada in 1996, and the governor of Sichuan province formally apologized to the world because they just got interested in U3A and apologized, having only created 7,300 U3As the previous year. I suspect the consultative process might have been a little limited. It might have been something like, right, Ian, 6,000 U3As by next Tuesday. Roseanne, another 7,000 by whatever it was. Anyway, and it's continued ever since. So it is painstaking work. And if we really want to establish an independent organization, then that independent organization has to develop at its own pace and its own way, without increasing dependency on Age Action or any other. It hasn't all been plain sailing, and several of the attempts have not succeeded. But there seemed to be growing interest in learning among older people. And I must say, just the atmosphere in this event today encourages me to think that. But during this time, we're an advocacy organization, and we wanted to put education in relation to a wide range of other activities. So during this time, not only do we promote U3As, and I should say, there are now 17 U3As in Ireland with several, as it were, information. We did other things as well, particularly specifying the needs of older people with particular barriers to overcome in terms of learning and social engagement. So we set about promoting learning activities for people, older people in residential care, which was very successful and is continuing. We then set about computer training for older people. And this has grown enormously in our successful Getting Started program, which has now helped over 15,000 people to learn computing and Skype and mobile phones and so on. And just to give you one example of that, some of the work that Roseanne and Ian are saying is that we're trying to change the complete attitude towards old age and aging among older people themselves as well. And so 2 years ago, we have a Civil Service Award, and one of the Silver Surfer Award winners was William Boyd in Skibbereen in County Kerry, and he started computing at the age of 102. Now, that's the engagement point was interesting. His eldest son was a missionary in Fiji, and he said to Ryan Tuberty at one point, he said, "I thought I'd never see him again, and now I see him every Saturday on Skype." So the 2 points, really very important. And lastly, we have developed a generations program that I mentioned Keelan was involved in, with an emphasis on promoting learning across the life course. And through all this work, I have to say, I want to pay tribute to the U3A in Northern Ireland and to Stuart in particular. They've given us tremendous support, and we have continually developed cross-border cooperation that's going on even in the last few weeks. And it's critically important we continue to do that. Now, I'm just going to make 1 or 2 points about issues that have come up from our work that might be helpful in the forum. First of all, some of the issues we're facing. Promoting greater participation of men in U3As or in any community or group. It's extraordinary, the imbalance. And I say that as a mere male, by the way, that we ought to be involved. Making U3As more attractive to more people with limited initial formal education. There could be, and it's suggested sometimes that U3As are elitist. But that's not an accusation, it's a perception. The third thing is challenging age discrimination everywhere, even among older people. And there is discrimination among older people, among different, and that has to be challenged all the time. And lastly, promoting greater collaboration among the many statutory and voluntary groups engaged in promoting learning for older people. The final point I want to make was, we have never claimed that U3A was the only way or model of encouraging learning among older people, but we think that its emphasis on independence and self-learning should have a powerful influence on future policies and practice in that regard. Thank you.
stay seated. Thank you very much indeed, Robin, for some wise suggestions, wise thoughts, wise caveats, and for that potted history of U3A in the Republic of Ireland. I'd like now to move, we're a little bit behind schedule, I'm afraid, but I'd like to move, ask the panel to come up to the platform, please. The names of our panel are on this slide. There is a roving mic on the panel, on the desk there. So you can hand that around. Jacinta, are we okay for lunch at 1 o'clock? Would that be all right if we break at 1 to give us a little bit more time? Because I do want people to have a chance to raise their questions and make their comments. So thank you for that. The roving mics are one on each side. And we had a chat about what we thought maybe would form the basis of a discussion. It doesn't have to be exclusively on this, but we thought one of the key things is how to increase public and media awareness. Would it be helpful to establish a U3A Ireland? I called it a national council, but maybe a trust such as the UK structure. Does there need to be a secretariat to improve communication between U3A groups? What efforts should be made to set up links or further links with U3A in Northern Ireland, UK, Europe? What about links with other organisations? Obviously, Age Action is a key link there and has been the host of the U3A organisations here so far. What about links with universities? How can universities assist? So I'd like to maybe start with the first point in terms of increasing public and media awareness. If anybody has any comments or any questions from the audience there or suggestions. Okay, there's somebody here, thank you.
I feel that there should be quite a bit more publicity about U3A. I've been in the group in Ballymun for 9 years now, and while we all know that it's there, there's an awful lot of people don't know it's there, and they've never heard of U3A, and you keep having to explain it. And I feel that if we could have some sort of a background group, certainly, and get into the national media a bit, that it would increase knowledge of it quite a lot.
I'm sure most people would agree with that. I suppose Stuart is the person who maybe has most experience with how did you get so big, or how did you get into the public consciousness in UK and Northern Ireland?
I think it's a constant struggle. I sometimes say facetiously that U3A is the biggest organisation that nobody's ever heard of. So I think you just have to take every opportunity you can. I was chairman of the Causeway U3A, and I got into a little bit of trouble with my committee because I said, we need to keep publicising. And they said, we've got 800 members, why do we need any more? And I said, doesn't matter, we need to keep getting out there and getting the message out. And within the Trust, we tried to do that at the national level. The Founders Lecture that I mentioned on Tuesday was an attempt to do that. For the first time ever, in December, U3A was invited to take part in an intergenerational debate in the House of Lords. You know, so we actually got into the debating chamber, and that got us a little bit of national publicity. I've done a bit in the north myself. We were invited to do the John Toll Saturday radio morning programme, and I went along with a somewhat similar set of slides. Obviously wasn't going to do it as a PowerPoint presentation, but just I was going to do the boring bit about what the Trust does. But I took along a member from Belfast, and she was so enthusiastic. She sold the U3A on that programme because she said, you know, it's great, I'm never in. And John Toll said, I know, we've been trying to get you for 3 days. So keep doing things like that.
What about members of the audience? Have you any suggestions? You're out there doing it. Gentleman at the back.
The speaker mentioned the medical model in relation to old age. The independent living movement in Ireland, which advocates on behalf of people with disability and significant mobility problems has been battling along the same path to promote the social model of care or living as opposed to just the medical model. Could I make a suggestion that there may be synergy to be had between Age Action talking to the Centre for Independent Living, which has a central unit up at Carmichael House, and there are 27 centres for independent living around the country, each of which is independent in its own operations and its own activities. And as someone who has just recently joined U3A, who had spent 8 years as director of the Greater Dublin Independent Living, one of the things that I would advocate, because I think that the experience so far and being here today is wonderful and it's so stimulating, and as was said earlier, it's to be interested and interesting, and I think this is what we're experiencing here today, and we all realise how important that is. But I would like to see a U3A that would embrace people like myself who have mobility problems, and there are other people like myself that couldn't be here today because they weren't sure if it would work for them. And because it was mentioned earlier about mobility problems and how they restrict life as we get older. And therefore, we need to think about having meetings in user-friendly places where there's adequate disabled car parking close to the venue, etc., etc. Small, practical points,
sure,
but they then don't exclude people. Thank you very much, and it's been wonderful to have the opportunity to be here.
Professor O'Neill wanted to come in there, I think.
Thanks very much. I mean, if there's any reassurance to you, the medical model is history. Since 1975, it's the biopsychosocial model, however imperfectly that may be executed. But you've raised an important point, and I think with the last speaker, there's a lot of firepower in this room, and I think you have the opportunity to try and bring together through Age Action, and I think particularly Age and Opportunity, a synergy. And you've raised a hugely important point about being inclusive. Now, I went to a wonderful U3A recently, but it was upstairs in a library, and in its, whatever workaround you've got there, that immediately is a bit of a challenge. And I think being inclusive includes not only around areas of ability and disability, but I think one of the key factors which is important in terms of the model you're going to adopt here is the issue of people who haven't had formal education before. And there can be a challenge in the U3A movement of perhaps attracting those who are at a higher educational level already. So ensuring that it's around this mixture of abilities. And in U3A units that have the mixture, everybody learns and everybody gains. Age and Opportunity have a particularly good model, just to say, in terms of their Go for Life, where they have exercise programs for older people, but that includes those who are severely restricted by mobility or disabilities, so you can do your exercise in a much more adapted way. So I think there's good models here, and bringing together the rather fractionated advocacy sometimes for older people is a potential role for the U3A.
That's certainly something that Robin Webster stressed.
When I mentioned medical model, it was in inverted commas. Oh, is that me?
That's me, I think.
Is that my personality? But I think it's really very important that we do become much more inclusive, I have to say. I think that's critical. Now, that's a core value for Age Action. We're an advocacy organisation, but we have to open these opportunities up. And I think the difference between ageing and development, the link between ageing and education and disability is critically difficult. And we've had a recent discussion about government in relation to mobility allowance, seeing that people can be disabled all their life, and when they're 65, they suddenly become old. We have to break down those barriers. And can I give you one example from the U3A history of the U3A in the UK? where there was a Russian expert who was bedbound, never mind housebound, and the U3A, because she was the expert, gathered around her bed for expertise, making clear that the person, disability is no barrier to contributing fully to the U3A, and that's important.
I think with Stuart and Professor Jones wanted to come in there.
I'll be very quick. I just mentioned in passing that Hilary Stringer, one of our vice chairmen, is in fact in a wheelchair. So in the NEC, at the executive committee, we're very conscious of that.
So she keeps you on the ball on that one. Joe?
I think just to say something about Trinity's involvement, and I'm nominally chair of the group, although I feel guilty about how little I do as chair. And what we're here partially as a role as Trinity. We're an old university, and we rather feel that this is part of what our role of a university should be. It's to support people who want to learn, people who want to continue their lives, and not just from an academic point of view, but continue to develop throughout their life. And we're here from the point of view of universities to listen to about what you want. We're not here prescribing anything. We're not here wanting to take over anything. We want to hear what people would like us to do and how they feel we could get involved. So for us, this is a listening experience as well. So I don't think there is any definition of what is and isn't U3A. We could have probably doubled the number of people. We could have used a bigger lecture theatre probably, because twice as many people applied to places here as actually were places available. So I think what we would, from the Trinity point of view, is like to hear what model you want for this and what we can do. Certainly in the first instance, we would like, if it's possible, to do this every year. That once a year, as a sort of, in conjunction with Age Action, to do something like this and perhaps take suggestions next year about what people would like to hear about or to learn about. But also perhaps act as a resource for people who want to develop groups or who may need some help or some advice.
Thank you. There's a gentleman here and then the lady at the halfway at the back there.
Just to go back to the initial question of public and media awareness, I'm a member of a U3A, but I know absolutely nothing about any other U3A organisation at all. I knew vaguely that Age Action had a role in it because that's how I found out about it. But that was just a phone call, and that was the extent of my contact with Age Action. So the obvious thing, I suppose, nowadays, we're all into it, is websites. I don't know how much there exists on websites. I know our U3 has no website at all. So if there were websites and if there was sharing of activities that we all do, it might help towards this thing of seeing the kind of activities that different organisations engage in, and then we have the formal and informal education that we discussed earlier. So we could learn, perhaps, if there was an active way of sharing information. And then there's money. If we're going to have publicity and media campaigns, there's money has to come from somewhere. Now, Age Action has some structure. I don't know how much money they have, but that's a question as well, because it does require resources. It requires resources of money and time. How much time am I prepared to give, or is anybody else prepared to give? Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, certainly one of the ideas we in Trinity had tossed around was the possibility of setting up a website that possibly could be hosted as a guest website to Trinity College, but it would be fed and watered by some sort of national organisation or the individual U3As. Now, there are some legal issues around that, and we'd have to check that out with the college secretary and the communications people, but that just might, if we could perhaps have a page that could be accessed either directly from individual U3A pages or from Trinity, that might be a communication, help fill the communication gap a little bit. So there was a lady up.
Thank you very much. Just coming back at a global level to try to give some response to some of the questions from my perspective. We're the UTA group out in Sutton Baldoyle that Professor Des O'Neill came along to, and we couldn't actually facilitate everybody came to the door, and we actually had to turn people away, which was very unfortunate. Now, some of them who were first-timers just came because of the attraction of Professor O'Neill. But it was but what he said was absolutely brilliant. And we're following his blogs and his connections, and even the latest one with Washington and the cherry blossoms and Dr. Evans is absolutely brilliant. But what we're finding is, yes, we are all the time coming across what's the definition of a university, and we actually go in and say, look, it's lifelong learning. And all the time, when we did a survey via one of the students, we found that there's very few third-level qualification people who are formally qualified in third level coming to our meetings, which is fantastic because it's lifelong learning and learning from experiences. Our model, from a communications perspective, we're all the time using free communication wherever we can get it, like the Northside people. mylocalnews.ie, we've had 4,500 hits since we set up there about a year ago. Parish bulletins, etc. And you'll still people say, well, I've never heard of you. So we're saying, well, look, it's self-directed learning. Here's the name out there. That's how most of us heard about it. We just go onto the internet, Google it. As regards to what the universities can do for us, we came across and linked up with the DCU and Intergenerational Learning Programme, and the model there suits us insofar as we're not committed to 2 semesters of doing something at a certain time, because people do have a whole pile of other time commitments. That model is suiting us. We get some sort of certification for anybody. But what we don't get is like the professional organisations model, which is you have to keep up your learning like CPDs. But if we went to this seminar now today and we were in one of the professional societies, we'd all be getting credit for 3.5 to 4 hours learning development credits. Now, the university wouldn't recognise our, I call it the triple L credit, like lifelong learning credit of 4 hours. And that could go towards something if somebody wanted a model for into the university. Our philosophy is there's enough of organisations out there providing learning opportunities at a formal adult education evening courses, and we're doing what we want differently at our time. For instance, yesterday we were talking about consumers and consumers' rights. Prior to that we had a whole pile of other things about the history of the development of beekeeping. It's completely diverse.
Fabulous, yeah.
So what we would like, just a few of us, we haven't formally come up with a policy because we learn as we go along. We don't really know next winter what we will be doing, but something will happen. It'll be novel and it has to be new, and we have to take ourselves every now and again out of our comfort zone. And I personally, this is a personal comment, the universities I don't honestly think are structured towards the way people are currently learning, and especially as people get older. And I think there may be a model for the returned veterans that they're using in the United States for adult learning and all virtual learning, online learning, maybe something that you could look at that would help anybody who wants to come in. And finally, we link with the Blue Mountains in Australia, and that's how we all developed our own website. And if I hadn't done the DCU Intergenerational Learning, we would have had no website. And the help then from Age Action in Abbey Street, when we had the Google technical expert in, was brilliant. And thank you very much, Age Action, for organising all of that, and for the universities for what you're actually doing. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Professor Lunny.
I just want to throw out one idea that I have. Just listening to Stuart, he told us about how important the national organisation was in promoting the development of the U3A. That's clearly something that we're missing here in the Republic, although Age Action is doing some things. I'm a member of the Institute of Physics, which is a professional organisation that operates in Britain and Ireland, and we have an Irish branch that stretches across the border. So I'm just wondering, I mean, should we consider the possibility that U3As here in the Republic might think about being members of the UK, the Third Age Trust in the UK? I mean, maybe that could be something that really could act to drive that development. So maybe that's an idea people could think about, and maybe Stuart could comment on that.
I don't actually think it would be legally possible because we are a registered charity. There would be an issue with that, I think. And I don't want to give the impression that all is sweetness and light in the development of the Third Age Trust over the years. The reason I emphasised what we provide for members is that although I personally think that the best value that the Trust can do is to help bring in new U3As, it's very difficult to sell that to existing members and say, here's why you should pay us a capitation fee. So we need to get both of it, providing services to the members in order to generate some funds to get new U3As.
Apropos the idea of a secretariat to improve communication between U3A groups and the suggestion of a national council, I think that we can have layer upon layer of admin and bureaucracy. And I feel that really there's a lot of energy at ground level among U3A groups. A few years ago, we had quite good communication between our groups through an e-bulletin, which was initiated by U3A in Age Action headquarters. Now, unfortunately, that didn't continue, so that we feel, our groups now feel rather isolated. It was great to see what is being done within other groups. And in fact, in our group in Lucan, we visited other groups because we got to know of them through the e-bulletin, and I would appeal for a return of that. I think there's something to be said for bottoms-up growth rather than something always coming from the top down. And personally, I have a horror of too much bureaucracy.
Absolutely. Please. Robin.
From an Age Action Ireland point of view, we have tried to develop at the pace of U3As and to provide support. And we have had several discussions over the 17 years about national network and so on. And there wasn't support from all the U3As. But if that's the mood of the meeting, as it were, as a group, we'd be glad to provide more support. But we have tried not to control U3As. And if anyone wants to read the story of the U3A and the U3A, the Third Age Trust, about the split, you know, and we haven't had a split yet, so clearly we're not really Irish, I suppose. But it is to do that. So we have developed it, and we would be glad to develop more and provide the resources. And we take that point very much, and we look at that. And we will certainly, Margaret will contact all the U3As and say, well, now, what else can be done? And we'll be glad to do it.
Thank you. I'm sure that's encouraging. This question here. We have a microphone there.
I just wanted to ask specifically how Trinity sees itself, what exactly you're offering to U3A. And the other thing I want to know is, in connection with your research, how does U3A come into that, and in what way would we be helping you if you help us? You're presumably not starting a specific U3A group in Trinity.
There's several questions there. First of all, I wouldn't presume to say what Trinity could do, particularly after the last speaker. But so I think what we had in mind was possibly hosting a website just that people could feed into. There may be other things, but it has to come from you, because we know this is the U3AA organisation groups are self-directed and they want to do their own thing. So we view ourselves as a possible resource, possibly hosting a list of lecturers who might be willing to talk to U3AA groups, just having it up there for you with contact details. something like that, maybe. The research side, I don't think there's any formal proposal or idea to use U3A as research. It's simply that research in ageing is a very strong theme in Trinity, and some of the things we have, I think, will be of interest, as has been mentioned already by both Roseanne and some of the things that are being worked on by Roseanne and by Ian. So I mentioned the tilde. Roseanne?
Yes. Some of the studies we're doing, like Tilda, the participants are actually chosen randomly from a community sample, so it doesn't apply to that particular study, but Ian's group particularly and many others in the Trinity EngAGE are involved in cohort studies where they're constantly looking for volunteers and participants to take part in cognitive engagement type of studies and testing technologies which might enhance cognitive engagement, etc. So we haven't thought through it in great depth, but I would say yes and yes.
Okay, that's not where we started from, though. Joe.
I mean, there's a person, when we started, and I think James could probably say, and Linda could say a bit more than this, there is actually, within Trinity, we are trying to work to develop something akin to a U3A within Trinity and interactive action. That's a separate thing. It's just, it struck us that there actually wasn't this in Trinity in the first instance.
Yeah.
So within the community in and around Trinity and in Trinity itself, to try and produce more interaction. That's the first step. So that is, there's another side. It's essentially setting up another U3A group for Ireland, just another group like Sutton or Lucan or Wexford. The second thing is that Trinity's view in this, we have no particular selfish view in this. We're acting as a sponsor. It's more a philosophical view of what the idea of a university should be. It's a community of people who want to encourage learning. Des and myself are both geriatricians by training, but I think we'd prefer to improve people's level of function and quality of life through encouraging their own personal development than by prescribing aspirin.
Okay. Des, you wanted to come in there?
Just very, very briefly. I've also suggested to our Ageing Consortium that we should consider the DCU age-friendly model, and I do think there's a whole range of educational experience in the U3A. I'm really impressed. But also I think there's a hope that at some level some people may wish to come back to college, and as college stands, college is designed for the 18 to 35-year-olds in a whole range of areas, from the type of course to even the gyms. Whereas DCU's got an age-friendly program in their sports hall and gym. So, I think this island's too small for us to be saying, we should be sharing our experiences. So I think there are opportunities in that way, and I think all universities in Ireland should become age-friendly. Can I ask you guys a question? One of the things that puzzles me is I can't quite work out is the link between Active Retirement Ireland, which used to be the Federation of Active Retirement Societies, and U3A, and there seems to be a lot of similarities. Could I ask for a hand count? How many people would be involved with an active retirement group as well? All right, so there's some joint area. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of the time. One last.
Hi there. My name is Margaret Fitzpatrick. I'm a resource. I've been the education officer with Age Action Ireland, and for the last, I think it's about the last 4 or 5 years. And this meeting here today is such a welcome meeting to bring everybody together. And what I would like to propose coming out of this meeting is that I think that there seems to be lots of ideas of what will be our next step moving forward, and what U3A groups want, and how Trinity can be used as a resource, or how maybe Age Action can be the national coordinating body. We've kind of worked along those lines without officially saying we are the national coordinating body, but how we can work together moving forward. And I propose, I put together a date on the 21st of May that maybe we could get 1 or 2 representatives from each group to meet me. I've got a lunch provided in Collins Barracks, and we can take our ideas and we can then move and we can work with Trinity with these ideas. So I'm just asking if representatives from the groups would like to think about it, and maybe we can get together and talk about how we can work with Trinity and how Trinity can be a resource and how we can work together going forward.
Okay, I think that's a great idea. Happy with that. I think we've got to draw to a close. I think there seemed to be a great enthusiasm for compiling some sort of a list of speakers, whether that's hosted on the Age Action website or on the Trinity website can be sorted out, but perhaps we can add that to our list of things to think about, as well as the other things that have come up from the speakers and from the panel. The website, perhaps it can be hosted in Age Action. It's on our website. It's on your website anyway. Yeah.
Yes. And we do have a newsletter and so on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we don't want to duplicate.
No, I think
we want to work together with Margaret.
Could I?
I'm always looking for contributions, because otherwise it's me and I sometimes I don't know what to say. But all the contributions are welcome, because the idea of the groups telling each other what the groups are doing.
Okay.
Can I make one point?
Yeah.
I think the U3As ought to get together. To follow up Des's point, it's probably time for the universities to get together, because there are different models. Huge in Galway with the Social Gerontology Institute. There are different models, and we work with all of them in different ways. And maybe there could be a gathering of ideas and examples of good practice that would help.
Thank you very much. I am going to draw the meeting to a close. We have been podcasting this so we can record the various comments and so on that have come in. The lunch is it upstairs or downstairs? Upstairs. It's just at the top of the corner in the back there upstairs. So you go out this way? No, go at the back. And turn left. Okay, so it's at the higher level. Remember, I think on your seats you've got a ticket to the old library for visiting the Book of Kells. That's valid for any time. So I do hope you'll get a chance to go and visit at some time at your convenience. And the gallery is open and it's free. And please take advantage of that if you wish. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to the technical support.